All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So we have plenty of time. I first just want to thank everyone for coming to the seminar today. Again, this is a special version of our evolution seminar series for Darwin Day this week. And we have a wonderful invited speaker here. After the seminar, we will have coffee and a little bit nicer snacks and some pastries outside. So you should feel free to hang around and discuss the contents of the talk with all of your colleagues while Arvid is talking with the students in the other room. So be sure to stick around for that, and I'll try and remind at the end as well. But with that, it is my huge pleasure to introduce our Darwin Day speaker for this year, Arvid Agren. Arvid is a research associate in the theory division at the Lerner Research Institute of the Cleveland Clinic, and is a part-time lecturer in the Department of Biology at Case Western Reserve University. He's also an affiliated researcher at the Evolutionary Biology Center at Uppsala University. He did his PhD on transposable element and genome size evolution in plants, I believe, with Stephen Wright at the University of Toronto. And then just did his postdoc in Andy Clark's lab at Cornell on conflict and coadaptation between sex chromosomes and mitochondrial genes with Drosophila melanogaster. He then worked as a Winter-Gren Fellow, both with David Haig at Harvard and as an independent researcher at the Evolutionary Biology Center at Uppsala. His recent work is on developing population genetic theory to understand how genetic conflicts arise and how they are resolved, and how they fit generally into models of social evolution. But he is also interested in the history and philosophy of science, as evidenced by his recent book, The Gene's Eye View of Evolution, which he will tell us more about today. The book kind of outlines the selfish genes account of evolution, sort of tracing its historical origins and clarifying some misunderstandings, and also just highlighting why so many evolutionary biologists still consider it a really useful heuristic. This is probably to many people, selfish gene is something made familiar or famous by Richard Dawkins, who actually wrote sort of the blurb for this book, which I think sounds fun and sounds very Richard Dawkins. Arvid Agren has undertaken the most meticulous, thorough reading of the relevant literature that I have ever encountered, deploying an intelligent understanding to pull it into a coherent story. And this I feel sounds very Richard Dawkins. As if that wasn't enough, he gets it right. So with that, I would like to have everyone welcome Arvid Agren.
Right. Thank you, Myron, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I've had a lovely time last night and this morning talking to several of you, and looking forward to more meetings later today. I was telling someone that over the years, I've met a lot of people who come through Wisconsin-Madison as undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, and everyone always has such nice things to say about their place, and I really start to see why that is. It's been a really lovely time. As Myron mentioned, I work at the Cleveland Clinic predominantly. So there's a big hospital with a research institute kind of attached to it. And I was talking to a colleague of mine, a pediatric oncologist, the other day, and I told him I was going to Madison, and he asked what for, and I told him, go for Darwin Day. Darwin Day, I've never heard of that. So I had to tell him what it was. But then I also told him one thing you have to appreciate about evolutionary biology is that evolutionary biology is a very historical field. And I mean that in two ways. So one, of course, is that it's an object of study. At the end of the day, what we're interested in is the history of life and its grand narrative. So even if we do experiments in the lab, study things in the field, at the end of the day, it's kind of with an eye to the historical processes that led to what we observe today. But we're also a historical field in another way, and that is that we take our own history very seriously. I was reading an essay by the American science journalist John Horgan, who some of you may know from his columns in Scientific American the other day. This is a republishing that he found from the 90s. And he kind of was writing about Steve Gould, and he described evolutionary biology as a field that no field of science is so burdened by its past as evolutionary biology. It reads as what literary critic Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence. And it goes on to say that, in fact, the discipline of evolutionary biology can be defined to a large degree as the ongoing attempt of Darwin's intellectual descendants to come to terms with its overwhelming influence. Now, Hawking is quite critical of Gould, and often I find myself agreeing with him. But here I feel very touched because I have to try to come to terms with the burden of history in evolutionary theory. And kind of the question that I've been particularly interested in is this debate around the so-called gene-side view of evolution. This is a way of thinking that was kind of first clearly laid out by the American George Williams in Adaptation and Natural Selection in 1966. A book that I still think, despite being is one of the most underrated books, that I would say is one of the most important books, at least published in the second half of the 20th century. And a lot of kind of the argument for the gene side view is laid out here, but a lot of us are kind of first introduced to it by a book that was published 10 years later, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, where again you get a lot of the same arguments, but presented in a much more forceful and in some ways much more confrontational kind of way. And what the gene side view does is that it kind of takes the original story of Darwin's and kind of somewhat turns it on its head. So we're used to thinking of the theory of evolution as being a theory about individual organisms. This is how Darwin thought of it. The individuals are very well diversified and survive, how good they are at attracting mates, and this variation in fitness is heritable. We will see certain traits become more common over time, and this is the kind of traditional theory of Darwinian evolution. The gene side view introduces then kind of a subtle shift, but with one that comes with quite dramatic consequences, and it does this by kind of arguing that organisms cannot be the central actors in our theory of evolution. Organisms are these kind of temporary occurrences. They are these kind of unique combination of one of its genotype, the environment, and the interaction. But that uniqueness, it only exists one generation, and then it's gone. What persists are genes. And genes then are kind of conceptualized as these kind of immortal structures that are passed on untouched until they mutate every generation. They are the ones that are forming lineages, and therefore they are the ones that have to be at the center of evolution. So kind of in the Dawkinsian way of speaking, then evolution becomes this struggle between selfish genes housed in transient bodies over evolutionary time. Now, by now, the gene side view has been around for half a century or so, but it occupies a rather peculiar position within evolutionary biology. It's not a straightforward empirical hypothesis that can be rejected or verified by a clever experiment, though it can certainly help us come up with good experiments. It's also not like an all-encompassing mathematical framework, though again, it's a good guide, starting point to come up with formal models. Rather, I'd say it's something more like akin to like a way of thinking. When Bill Hamilton, whose name will come up later in this talk, when he reviewed it for Science, he described it as a new way to read nature. Similarly, kind of in the extended phenotype, Richard Dawkins described it as a particular way of looking at animals and plants, and a particular way of asking why they do the things they do. And now, kind of depending on who you ask, this either represents a really kind of profound way of looking at the world, or as kind of a really misleading or indeed kind of harmful way of looking at the world. And both of these attitudes are quite well represented in our field as a whole, but also by what you can think of somewhat the kind of the aristocracy of the field. You can take two good examples. That is, indeed, on one hand, Bill Hamilton, on the other hand, Richard Lewontin, both of whom reviewed The Selfish Gene right when it came out, but as we shall see, had somewhat different takes on the value of it. So started with Hamilton, who reviewed it for Science, who kind of goes on to start to say, this is an excellent summary of the state of evolution, state and future of evolutionary theory. And on top of that, it's a book that can and should be read by everyone. Lewontin, who reviewed it for Nature, had somewhat different opinion on its value. He described it as a caricature of Darwinism. He not just was this wrong, but kind of misleadingly and harmfully so. But it kind of evolutionary biology concerns in the audience. Here in this review, published 2 years before the Spandrels paper, Lewontin uses the Panglossian as a term to kind of accuse this way of thinking and naive adaptionist thinking. it also finally singles out the American Naturalist, the journal, as a particularly egregious place for this kind of adaptive storytelling. But the tone, as you see, of Lewinson's review is quite turned up and would kind of set a tone for a lot of exchanges. In fact, it was so kind of turned up that Hamilton felt the need to write a reply to it, calling Lewinson's review a disgrace and kind of comparing his behavior to that of Bishop Wilberforce, who you may recognize, who was the one who debated Thomas Henry Huxley in Oxford over evolutionary theory. And in that debate, Huxley is meant to have said that, you have a really smart person using his intellect in his kind of dishonest ways, and that's kind of what Hamilton was accusing Lewinson of doing. Lewinson, not one to back down from a fight, fired back in the same journal, pretty much telling Hamilton to calm down, and saying to Hamilton thinks that he is Hamilton, as he is Darwin, that Dawkins is Huxley. So at this point, we've almost made it to the beginning of 1977, and this kind of would set the tone for the debates that would follow. I would say that the Dean's view is a tremendously powerful way to think about the world, a great thinking tool to take on the logic of the natural world. But like with all tools, to get the most out of it, you must understand what was this tool designed to do. You can always come up with that if your hammer, everything looks like a nail, but if you understand what the hammer was designed to do, you can get the most out of this hammer. And here, I think, any sign of influence aside, here I think is where a place where history really can play a good role to help us understand and make sense of a kind of scientific disagreement. So what I want to do is kind of like lay out what I think of as kind of like the three kind of intellectual historical legs that the genocide view stands on. Here I represented it by three photos and by Paley, Fisher, and Hamilton, because I think to me, between them, this stands for these kind of three parts of it, which is one, the kind of, which is an idea about what is the central problem that we are trying to solve. It's a version of population genetics, particularly well represented by the Fisherian way. And then it's this kind of like more immediate kind of proximate cause, which is this, that it grows out of this rejection of group selection and the kind of like emergence of alternative ways of thinking, best illustrated by Hamilton. And I will go through this one by one. I picked Paley to illustrate this kind of adaptationist attitude, because Paley and adaptation, I think, are connected in the sense that I think you can think of adaptationism in evolution biology partly as a legacy of the strong standing of natural theology. Natural theology is a branch of certain religious tradition that believes that you can kind of make inferences about the divine world from studying the natural world. This is kind of was the subject of Paley's book of the same name, this best-selling Natural Theology. And from this, I think DSW has inherited this view that adaptation, or the appearance of design, is the central problem of evolutionary biology. That is the central part that we should try to explain. And natural theology, in some ways, kind of was based around the same idea that the best evidence of the divine come from studying these kind of what they describe as design, but we now would describe as kind of adaptations. So if you read Paley's Natural Theology, it's a really lovely description of natural history. It has all these kind of lovely examples of adaptations, but then usually with a twist and hence the creative kind of thing. But if you can kind of look past that, it's a really fun book to read even today. For the botanist in the audience, I should warn you that his chapter on botany starts by like, I won't dwell too much on botany because isn't that great evidence there as there is compared in the animal examples. But it's a really fun book. And I think this certainly, you can make an argument that this tradition that taking an adaptation of natural has been particularly strong in England, where natural theology was kind of intimately linked with the Anglican establishment church. And I think the most fun to kind of illustrate the kind of Palean influence is to quote three generations of English biologists and their attitudes to Paley. So Darwin, who of course came to Cambridge to read theology, having left Edinburgh Medical School because of his, he couldn't stand the sight of blood. So he comes to Cambridge, he's forced to read a lot of things, but he describes Paley in Natural Theology. I don't think I've ever admired a book more than Paley's Natural Theology. I could almost formally have said it by heart. This, of course, is familiar now that Darwin is in the process of losing his faith two who never really had much of a say is John Maynard Smith and Richard Dawkins. But Maynard Smith also described that the main task of any theory of evolution is to explain adaptive complexity. That is to explain the same set of facts which the 18th century theologian Paley used as evidence of a creator. Similarly, Dawkins described that Paley had a proper reverence for the complexity of the living world and saw it as a very special kind of explanation. And he described himself as a neo-Paleist obsessed with the illusion of purpose. So now you can I think you can somewhat build a nice argument here. You have kind of English tradition of natural theology that deeps into evolutionary biology in a natural way. Good reminder not to be seduced by history, specifically for those of us who are not proper historians, that there always are exceptions. A good one here, of course, is George Williams, who does not come from the same kind of background as Darwin, Maynard Smith, and Dawkins. They're all kind of product of similar kinds of private boarding schools. They all go on to Oxford and Cambridge. Williams was not like that, came from a much more kind of ordinary American middle class background. But he too was taken by Paley. In Adaptation and Natural Selection, he uses several of Paley's examples to describe the power of natural selection. In one of his last books that he published, simply called Natural Selection, he includes as an appendix a whole excerpt from Paley's natural theology in the book. So kind of independently, he too was kind of taken by the adaptation is the central problem, and Paley, nothing else, a great rhetorical device to use to bring home that point. But I think the central thing to pick up here is that for the gene subview, adaptation is the central problem. And I think you can kind of contrast that with other traditions in evolution biology that perhaps stop looking at all of that diversity is the central problem that we try. The variation, that is what we're trying to explain. But here you kind of central that is adaptation, less so diversity lies the central problem. That's the first leg, I'll say that it's on. The second leg that the gene subview stands on is kind of this kind of broader population genetic history. So this is kind of in the aftermath. There's a couple of decades after where Haldane, Civil Rights, and Fisher lay out the kind of foundations of the field. And arguably, I think you can say that gene subview is somewhat implicit in most population genetic, arguably. But I would say that like Fisher does stand out here and does deserve kind of be mentioned explicitly. And in particular, there's one reason for this, and that is his 1918 paper, the correlation between relativism and superstition of Mendelian inheritance, where he kind of introduced this expanded notion of the environment that I think is kind of crucial to the gene subview. Now, this 1918 paper is known for many reasons. One of these papers where you kind of statisticians also claim Fisher very much as one of their own. He introduces and defines the concept of variance, which in itself would have made this paper a one for the history books. But also kind of he uses that because one thing he wants to do in this paper is exactly what it says on the label. What should be the correlation between relatives in their traits if we assume that Mendelian inheritance is occurring? Remember, that is kind of the problem of the day. How can you kind of get gradual variation and cumulative change under superstition of Mendelian inheritance, which was at this time thought to be incompatible? So what Fisher wants to do, one thing he wants to do, is that he wants to kind of calculate the effect of kind of substituting one allele for another. So going from being homozygous for one allele, say big A, so what going from big A to heterozygous big A little a to little a. In that kind of substitution of one allele for another, you want to keep everything else constant in order to isolate that particular effect. And in so doing, he points out, well, you need to kind of keep the environment constant. But then he points out that the environment is kind of broader than what we usually think. We usually think of it as kind of like temperature, pH, rainfall, and so on. But he points out that actually, from a gene's point of view, the environment also includes the rest of the genome, as well as all the other alleles that are segregating in the population. So then kind of the genes, from a gene point of view, everything is the environment. There's no difference between just the other genes in the genome and the temperature of the environment, the kind of external environment that you live in. And I think this is kind of a way of thinking that only really makes sense from a gene's point of view. And you can kind of see this influence both in Williams and in Dawkins. This is just a quote from the new preface that he wrote for the 30th anniversary edition, where he described that each gene is pursuing its own selfish agenda against the background of other genes in the gene pool. That is the set of candidates of sexual shuffling within species. And I said, those other genes are part of the environment in which each survives in the same way as the weather, predators and prey, supporting vegetation, and soil bacteria are part of the environment. So what we're interested in is that when we think about the fate of a specific allelic variant, allele in the population, we're interested then in this kind of like the average effects that it has across environments. And again, this kind of comes back to kind of something that's kind of the heart of the gene's eye view of evolution, which I can sometimes think of kind of Fisherian averaging strategy. So as we'll see, kind of a contentious part about what Fisher did is that you often argue you can calculate kind of the average effect of a specific allele across the environment. Dawkins introduces this idea of that you can think of the genome as a rowing boat, and in a sport like rowing, you win and lose as a whole crew, but it's still individual rowers within that group will be differently skilled at rowing. So how do you may think that you're selecting upon rowing boats, but it was actually what you're selecting upon is individual rowers. And the way you do that is that you scramble the different rowers into different combinations and see, is this particular rower on average more successful than others? Now, is this a meaningful way to do population genetics? Well, so have people disagreed for a long time. And in many ways, you can kind of trace a lot of disagreements about the genes I've used in general back to kind of disagreements between Fisher and of course his major antagonist formerly of this parish, Sewell Wright. So Sewell Wright reviewed the genetical theories of Fisher's great grand book. And he says something interesting that I think that you can kind of see echoed in later reviews of the selfish gene, is that Sewell Wright writes about the genetical theory that Fisher and I would be in exact agreement in all cases if dominance and epistatic relations were completely lacking. And then he goes on to say, actually, dominance is very common, and with respect to such characters as fitness, it may safely assume that there are always important epistatic effects. Genes favorable in one combination are, for example, extremely likely to be unfavorable in others. So in other words, it's kind of like averaging strategy that Fisher wants to use does not work. So you keep that in mind, you move forward some 45 years in time, and Mike Wade is reviewing the selfish gene. And he said, he starts to say that in this book, Dawkins attempts to present an exposition of evolution theory which is accessible and appealing to the general public on the one hand, and patiently rigorous and enlightened to the genetical aspect on the other. If evolution in natural population followed the paradigm developed by R.A. Fisher, he might have succeeded. And then it goes on to say, actually, dominance and epistasis are tremendously common and kind of so I think there's a lot of time you can kind of trace this argument back in time. I think we'll talk about this in the class, but I wrote a separate paper on kind of, so Sewell Wright was the only one of that kind of the founder of population genetics that kind of lived long enough to directly comment on the gene's eye view. And one of his last papers that he published in Evolution, it does discuss this and kind of comes back to his unhappiness with Williams and Dawkins and Maynard Smith and others. So I wrote this short paper for the 75th anniversary of evolution, kind of looking back specifically at this kind of disagreement between Fisher and Wright. So the gene's eye view then kind of takes this kind of adaptation as the central problem. It adopts this kind of Fisherian view of what population genetics is, but then it kind of moves into kind of this third, I think, leg that it stands on. And this is the one that's kind of the most proximate in the timing of things. So the gene's eye view emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, which is a time where our views on the evolution of social behavior is kind of undergoing a transformation. This is a time that's kind of well documented about various forms of group selection. Arguments are in the air, and both Dawkins and Williams are quite unhappy with it. The subtitle of Williams' book was A Critique of Some Current Evolutionary Thought, and the current evolutionary thought that he's critiquing is largely what he considers this kind of naive for the good of the species kind of group selection. What can be thought of as kind of like the four heroes of selfish gene, which is in addition to George Williams, John Maynard Smith, Robert Trewis, and Bill Hamilton, are all people who are kind of introducing alternatives to group selection. And with Maynard Smith's game theory models, Trewis' ideas of reciprocal altruism and parent-offspring conflicts, and then, of course, Hamilton's ideas about inclusiveness. And I would say of particular importance then was Hamilton's concept of inclusive fitness, this idea that what matters to an individual is not just the offspring that that you produce, but also that others produce that you are causally responsible for, and we weigh this by relatedness. This turns out to be a tremendously powerful way to think about a lot of classic problems in social behavior, particularly those around social insects, like in this example where you have a massive queen and then you have her sterile workers, and how on earth can sterile workers evolve, and inclusive fitness and the related concept of kin selection have proven a powerful way to make sense of such problems. Now, inclusive fitness and kin selection is one of these ideas that, like, on the surface is quite straightforward, quite easy to get, but it's also notoriously difficult to do it properly. So in inclusive fitness calculation, you both have to account for the offspring of others that you as an individual are causally responsible for, but then you also need to strip away from you, your direct fitness, the offspring that others in the population were causally responsible for. This is something that's quite easy in a two-way interaction, but quite complex when you do it for more than two players. And indeed, to kind of like make sense of the logic of the inclusiveness, the first time, as far as I can tell, that the term selfish genes is used in this way is if you go back to the lecture notes that Richard Dawkins typed up when he had been asked as a graduate student to substitute for his PhD advisor, tried to win college, Nico Timberg, who was away on sabbatical. And Timberg had left him his notes, they were not slides at the time, but he had notes that this is what I usually talk about. But Dawkins had just read Hamilton. This was in 1966, so 2 years after the two big papers. That I want to talk about that, but he was a graduate student, he was quite nervous. He was also going to talk about something quite complex, so he typed up on a typewriter his notes what he was going to say, kind of word by word. If you go back to those notes, you can see that he describes, you can see a language that you start to become familiar later on, but genes are in a sense immortal. They pass through generations, reshuffling themselves each time they pass from parent to offspring. The body of an animal is about a temporary resting place for the genes. The further survival of the genes depend on the survival of the body, at least until it reproduces, and genes pass on to another body. To use the term selfish and altruistic then, our basic expectation on the basis of orthodox neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is that genes will be selfish. So the genes I view is kind of, in some ways, in the kind of Dawkins side of the story, is kind of birthed out his attempt to try to explain inclusive fitness to undergraduate students. And I think it's kind of somewhat underappreciated the role that teaching had to play in the emergence of the gene side. So kind of taken together, so I think these are the three legs then that the genes I view stands on. It's a commitment to one kind of problem and a particular way of solving that problem. So another way, I think, of kind of summarizing that whole thing is kind of by asking that, like, when we say that an adaptation is for the good of something, what is that something? So this shows that, like, what we're trying to explain is adaptation, and the way to answer that question is to answer what is it good for? Who is the beneficiary of this process? And then it comes back, it can't be the individual organism. This is too temporary. It's just present in one generation, then it's gone. The only thing the argument goes that has the prerequisite longevity play the role of an evolutionary beneficiary are genes. So therefore, the argument goes adaptations are for the good of the gene. And now, the genes view then has kind of come to play this interesting role, I think, in evolutionary theory, kind of simultaneously influential and contentious. It kind of earned its initial strides by making sense of kind of older problems in evolution. So, like, it was a good way to make sense of kind of the old problems of social behaviors, kind of the classical problems that Darwin describes as one special difficulty. How can you explain the evolution of work, sterility, etc.? So it's kind of emerges through that tradition. But I don't think it would have had the standing that it thus had if it also did not help us look at new things and point out new directions of research. And I think that is one thing that DCW did really well at this time, that it pointed out to new things that we could study. And one person I think who recognized this more than most was John Maynard Smith. This is an illustration from an essay that he wrote for the New Scientist magazine, the British popular science magazine. It's an essay from 1985, so 10 years after Ed Wilson's sociobiology had come down as a bomb. And what he was asked to by the editors of New Scientist was that they wanted him to kind of reflect on a decade on this debate, what has happened. But he also took the opportunity then to kind of look forward, what do we have in the future? So in this essay, he kind of goes through what has happened in the broader field of sociobiology, what do we learn about animal behavior. But he also then takes a chance, I think, to kind of say that taking what he calls a gene-centric view has changed how we view what behavior and social evolution is. And he ends his essay by arguing that now we turn our attention from kind of how social evolution occurs between organisms to it may happen inside of organisms. And he ends his essay by saying, how did it come about that most genes, most of the time, play fair, such as the gene success depends only on the success of the individual that carries it? Because what Smith and others in the mid-1980s had begun to realize, and that we now know with full force, there are many ways for genes to play unfair. These days in literature, we usually just call these selfish genetic elements. So these are genes that have some way of promoting their own transmission or their own fits, even if it comes at the expense of other genes or indeed at the expense of organismal fitness. And this, has many ways been the bread and butter of the research that I do on a kind of day-to-day basis. And largely, because this is truly a weird and wonderful world. Each example is slightly more bizarre than the next. So you have things like meiotic drivers, you see segregation disorders that, and these are genes that during the process of meiosis, rather than ending up in 50% of the gametes, as would be mandated kind of by Mendelian rules of inheritance, they have ways of interfering in that process, and so it ending up with 99% of all gametes. You have things like homonucleases that, when present in a heterozygous state, damages its sister copy, uses itself as a template to repair that site, and now, by virtue of being homozygous, guarantees its own transmission to the next generation. You have things like transposable elements, these mobile genetic elements that have the ability to make copies of themselves and then insert into new locations in the genome, a process that has earned them the nickname of jumping genes. So it's a great way for them to make new copies of themselves, but then this kind of movement also causes various forms of point mutations, chromosomal rearrangements, insertions, and deletions, which means that on average, they're typically slightly deleterious. One of the earliest examples of genetic conflicts that were discovered was that between uniparentally inherited mitochondrial genes. Mitochondrial genes are typically inherited from mother to offspring in our species and in most other species most of the time. In other words, that from a mitochondrial point of view, the only way to the next generation is through female. So kind of, regardless of how many offspring any male will have, it will never pass it on. And that has the consequence of that, from a mitochondrial point of view, you much rather be in a female, whereas nuclear genes, you have to route through both males and females, have a different interest in how many males and females you should produce. So you kind of, particularly in hermaphroditic organisms like most plants, you get a conflict over sex allocation between mitochondria and nuclear genes. And in general, this kind of idea that most genes, because genes are not inherited in the same way, and you may have kind of transmission asymmetries between sex chromosomes and autosomes, is another source of kind of antagonisms that may arise in the genome. Finally, things like genomic imprinting is a slightly different example in that these are examples where the expression of a genes depend on whether it was inherited from the mother or from the father. These are genes that are perfectly fairly inherited by Mendelian standards, but the interest of a particular gene may differ from the organism in which it's in, depending on whether it was inherited from the father or the mother. And these kind of within organism conflicts are not restricted just to genes. You get them at the cellular level as well. These days, spend a lot of time thinking about cancer, which is kind of classic examples of internal conflict. But also have things like mitochimerism, which is this phenomenon where you can notice that when an offspring is born, you kind of get some of the maternal cells persists in the offspring. So they there are cells that clearly come from the mother, but they stay in the offspring. And reciprocally, then offspring from the fetus can persist in the mother, and they persist for a long time. We don't really necessarily know exactly what they do. But what's more is that cells from the first offspring persist in the mother and may then be in turn passed on to second offspring. And again, they persist for a long period of time. Are these in conflict with the their new host body? Is this a way of signaling between mother and offspring? We don't know. There's some great theories that do some suggestive empirical observations, but it's kind of from a kind of a paranoid mind damaged by reading too much about within organism conflict. It screams conflict to me, but the data isn't there to kind of rule it out from that. There are many people from the kind of traditional pregnancy literature who see this as kind of signaling between mother and offspring. But kind of in addition to kind of like my broader history, interest in kind of history and philosophy, all these kind of things, I also think that a genes of view is kind of a tremendously powerful way to look at these things and make them stand out and getting you interested in them. We have recently I've been kind of interested in this idea what we thought of as the paradox of the organism. This is from one of the perhaps less read things that Dawkins wrote. He was asked to give a plenary lecture at the Parasitology conference in the UK in 1990. And he uses this to introduce this idea of a paradox of the organism, which is simply this idea that the paradox is that it's not torn apart by its conflicting replicated, but stays together, work as a purposive entity, apparently on behalf of all of them. Not only is it not torn apart, it functions such a convincingly unified whole that biologists in general have not seen there's a paradox at all. And another way of expressing the same thing is that given all these kinds of conflicts that may occur inside of a body, why don't they get out of hand? Why is it that, as much as I think the kind of intricacies of these biological conflicts are interesting and fun to kind of work out the logic and consequences of them, for a lot of questions in evolutionary biology, you kind of find as ignoring that you don't have to think about that this is kind of a conflicted entity with multiple maximizing agents within. You just find treating the organism, or the individual organism, as a fitness maximizing entity, and that will give you great predictive power if you want to understand, mating behavior of a mutant, right? So you don't need it. But why is that? Why is that the body functions so well? So, and kind of one thing that I've been interested in is trying to kind of come up with a way to kind of think about how and why do the fitness optima of different within organisms differ enough that it no longer makes sense to think of the organism as one cohesive form. So I spent most of the time talking about a book that I have wrote in the past, and now kind of just like a plug for a book that we have coming out this fall, where Magnus Patton and I brought together both biologists and philosophers and kind of gave them somewhat of a simple prompt, and that is like, what does taking within organism conflict seriously do for this one thing that you are interested in? So we have philosophers reflecting on things like the basic ideas of level selection, what an organism is, kind of more abstract questions that a lot of philosophers are interested in. We have people like David Haig and Nina Dell writing about the role of conflict in like sex and development. And then we also have some more kind of practical consequences. So Colin McCoy writing about the role of conflict in conservation and taking that seriously within corals. Amy Boddy and I have a chapter on kind of the role of conflict and place in developing better things like cancer therapy and understanding pregnancy complications better. But in general, if this is something that you are interested in, I think that like conflict is something quite cool, come join our merry gang. We have this special topic network funded by the European Evolution Society, where we're going to do two main things. So one is that we do these kind of virtual seminars every month, which we get two people come in, talk about their work. We also do this occasionally, this kind of in-person events. The next one is going to happen in conjunction with the evolution meeting in Barcelona, the ESA meeting in Barcelona. And we have a little bit of money that we're going to start using to get kind of early career research, graduate students and junior postdocs, to give them a little bit of travel money to go visit a new lab to kind of help establish collaborations to try to promote the understanding of the role of these kinds of internal conflicts in evolutionary theory. And that's kind of where I want to end it. I think like the genes view has been this kind of played this influential but contentious role in evolution biology. I do think it's a tremendously powerful thinking tool. But I think we always need to remember that depending on how you view the world, different things going to stand out. There's no universally best kind of glass. It's going to depend on who you are as a person and what you are interested in. And I think we should always worry about what kind of questions a metaphor makes us ask, but also what kind of questions can kind of go unasked. So I've tried to make a case that the gene survey is really good to maybe see things like conflicts and kind of especially how they can occur in places where I may not expect them, such as like kind of in the early days, where Trivers show that there may be conflict between parent and offspring, which is the thing. But I think also then more lately how it can be conflicts within organisms. I mean, again, that we thought that was always kind of harmonious. But of course, the gene survey is not great at other things. If you're interested in, you know, in epistasis, if you're interested in kind of more kind of complex interaction, it may not be the best tool for you. But I think, again, I think it is a powerful tool. If you can understand what it is and what you're trying to do, you can get the most out of the gene's eye view. And with that, thank you again for coming. It's been really fun to hear. Okay, yeah. Good.
So, what do you think of the view that the debates about whether a gene is really a unit of evolution is mostly a semantic argument? Because as long as you can measure heritable variation, assign a fitness, you can iterate from one generation to that next and make predictions of frequency. You can do that for organism phenotypes. You can do that for an exon sequence. And as long as you can do that, following that logic, there is no primary unit of selection. The unit of selection is anywhere there's heritable variation.
So I think it's semantics, but I don't think it's mere semantics, if that makes sense. I think that it's like part of it is the early days of this debate was marred by people using the same word to mean different things. If you want to say, like, I think they kind of debate is this the unit of selection? I think it's the wrong question. I think it's the right question is like how are you using the word unit of selection? And I think like this was a debate that I think kind of coincided with the rise of philosophy of biology as its own kind of distinct field. And one of the kind of early people who I think really did a fantastic job kind of cleaning up a lot of this kind of confusion was Lisa Lloyd. And she has argued that you can kind of think of like, when we talk about units of selection, we kind of use it in four slightly different kind of ways. So one is like the replicated vehicle, replicated interactor distinction between that comes from the gene view that replicators are like genes are what is being passed on. That's usually genes, so what we call replicator. Second kind of way to use it is in the kind of interactor vehicle. It's like what are the kind of entities actually interacting with the world and interacting with other things. The third level that we can talk about is like what's the level of adaptation? Where does adaptation arise? Is it at the individual or at the group level? And the fourth one is what is the beneficiary of this selection? So the beneficiary question, which is almost usually the gene, because that is what passed on. But I think you kind of see, depending on, I think you can use them in a meaningful way in all four ways, and maybe even more. So I think like is this the unit? Yeah, maybe not, but like I think it's kind of clear what you mean. I think you'll be fine. Yeah.
First of all, great talk. Brought back a lot of fond memories from the 70s. But I just had a couple of thoughts. One was that the business of Hamilton being the third leg of the argument. I mean, subsequently, we know theoretically and empirically that group selection, like organismal selection, like media selection, actually happens. Right. So, I mean, there still is the issue with group selection and how the initial variance arises in one groups, but nevertheless, we know it can work.
Yeah.
So I would maybe think about downplaying that. The second is having known Dick Lewington and Steve Gould and Maynard Smith and Wilson and company. I have to say the good of the students in the audience who may have read Spangles of San Marco and thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. There was a lot of problems with that paper. It was on the one hand good in that it brought rigor, the importance of rigor back into the discussion of adaptation. At the same time, it threw a lot of good work under the bus in terms of ecological genetics and adaptive thinking. And it put in its place what was the revealed truth at the time, which was, oh, constraints are very important. But never did they show in their lives, not let alone in that paper, how to identify constraints rigorously. the constraints are real, but they could be genetic in terms of, developmental, constraints or, interactions within the genome, but they could also be environmental constraints. Or constraints due to competition from, or mutualism with other lineages. And finally, I guess I would say that many of the supposed straw men that they attacked involved systems where nothing was known about the ecology. It was arguing about, oh, what's the difference between a one-horn and two-horn rhinoceros? Whereas it turns out that actually there are different kinds of environments. So anyway, this is to leave you with that. Interested in your response, particularly to the first issue involving Hamilton.
Yeah, so I'm going to take them in turn. So I think, yeah, so the first one, I think the nuance I think to keep in mind is that there are kind of two ways I think that there are early origins of the genes that view relates to group selection. So first, I think it's like this is kind of proximate way. What was their issue in the air that they were responding to, and there I think like plays a special role. There's also been, I think, there was this kind of change in like how the genes IB was presented as an empirical alternative to group selection versus like as an alternative kind of perspective to group selection. Now, group selection has a complicated history. Today, like modern models of today, we usually call them multi-level selection, right? Anyone who's worked with this kind of model recognize you can make sound, proper models of group selection. So we can quibble about what, how we should do them and what's your preference tool of sort, but I think no one reckon. Oftentimes they will give exactly the same kind of prediction of change as a inclusive fitness model. Now, then it becomes what are you interested in? Are you interested in kind of rate of change or direction of change and so on? But I think like there was a much stronger claim of adaptation, natural selection, and selfish gene, where the genes was presented as an empirical alternative. And particularly Williams had this kind of strong argument that group selection is a weak force to the clean nature. That's an empirical claim, right? And I think that attitude to that has changed. I agree with your, I don't know if putting words in your mouth about skepticism or nuances about Spandrell's paper. I think, particularly for the reasons that you identify, I think it's a great mistake that a lot of people read Spandrell's when they come to graduate school, but they don't read the other papers from the same symposium. There are like particularly two that should be read. One is the one by Tim Clotterbrook and Paul Harvey about the comparative method, which is a way to make inferences about how important our selection has been and be rigorous about adaptationist claim. The second paper from that symposium people should read is the one by the chair of the symposium, Arthur Kane, who makes pretty much the 2 points that you make. He's perhaps his adaptation has been described not over the top but pretty close to it. He has this paper called The Perfection of Animals. And that may seem like, well, that's just like wishful adaptation thing. It's not. It's all about that, like adaptation is a fantastically interesting problem. How do we think about rigorously studying and talk a lot about constraints? His introduction to this issue from the meeting is the kind of special issue from the Royal Society. He can't help his frustrations with Lewitton shine through. And he kind of makes this point like, what does he want us to do? Like not try at all. Like we want to understand adaptation. We can't just like throw up our hands and say it's constraints. And then like, that's not proper science. We should try our best to understand. This comes up also in his 1988, he was the president of ESEP in his 1988 lecture. He makes the same point, like we need to start somewhere, but let's be rigorous about it. So I think those are two things, so really areas of the comparative method, but also Arthur Kane's kind of almost like response to it. So I think that's a big problem. People read it in isolation. Remind me, what was the third point? Sorry, I've been talking about.
It's just the 2 points.
Okay, yeah.
Fascinating talk, and I think Bill Hamilton would have appreciated it too. I'm interested in the paradox not seen, the fact that organisms hang together despite the existence of selfish genetic elements, transposons, and so forth. This continual tension must exist between cooperation and fairness, like nuclear restore genes that can repair meiotic dissegregation. And more selfish elements. You study breakdowns, you study the selfish elements. So my question is, how can we study gene cooperation?
Yes.
How what signs does it leave? What tracks in the genome?
Well, I think that's it. I don't know. The short answer. The longer answer is like, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, because the problem has somewhat been, I would say, is that we almost take like gene cooperation for granted. And the way we often discover genetic conflicts has been by accidents. That like a lot of people who kind of discover a new kind of genetic conflict don't set out to do that. There are people who do loads of crosses, and all of a sudden a cross doesn't work anymore. You get a sterile male, you get a sterile son, and then like you go back, what is this? And all of a sudden you realize it's because it's mitonuclear compatibility, or it's just like the science and this transposon does not work anymore, or so on. So you often like the way you kind of get into that, you make a lot of crosses between diverse population or closely related species. What does it mean to have kind of like gene cooperation? I mean, there's been some kind of like hand wavy results. I mean, it's a bit about the parliament of genes, but that's kind of like a very verbal model. That's much rigor to it. People have done kind of simple models where you pretty much just take a classical gene selection model and just change the name of the variables instead of like individuals interacting. Now you have genes or molecules interacting. Surprise, it works. But again, I don't know. That's what we should be doing. I sometimes thought it would be really nice to think more about people who think about like we talk about their origin of life, but like kind of earliest models of like when new molecular networks come together. Is that something that like we should like get those people in the same room as social evolution people to kind of? I don't know. Is the short answer. I think that they would be super interesting to think about, and how much of a genome is actually like, is it one kind of cohesive social thing, or should we think of it as a kind of constellation of things where some of it's just kind of like around, like it makes no sense to think about cooperation between these different chromosomes. You can only think about it in gene networks.
So some of the rowers in the boat that may be cooperating might also be kicking each other, or
Yeah,
each other in minor ways.
Yeah, and some maybe the boat is so big that a lot of them don't even barely know that there are other rowers there, but they're like.
I'm fascinated that you mentioned this idea of hybridization between populations, because for a long time I thought the Jansky-Muller incompatibilities that emerge and prevent reintegration of a single populations under one species might reflect these discordances between cooperating genes and cheating genes.
Yeah.
And you've got restorer genes going on and selfish genes emerging all the time. But if they evolved independently in different lineages, they won't work with each other when they come back together.
Yeah, and I mean, this was an idea that people mooted kind of in the early 1990s. A lot of people like Lawrence Hurst and graduate student of Hamilton, they had this idea that conflict is a great source of genetic incompatibilities. We got polysomy speciation genetics in the room. I think the speciation establishment came down quite hard on that idea, saying that it won't work. But now, later on, now you have people like Patrick Nosel and others writing papers about how genetic conflicts are a great source of speciation. So I think like the empirical evidence have shifted now. Of course, it's going to be a question about frequency and how relative importance. But like if you want, that's an area where you have selection of one kind of gene leads to selection of other. So this is going to be a great kind, and it may not be the most important or super relevant in all cases, but clearly going to be an example in some cases. I think again, that's why we keep detecting that in cosmos, to get this mismatch between restorers.
And if I could be allowed a last question, I was interested going back to the early part of your talk about Fisherian beanbag genetics and this conflict between Wright and Fisher, of course. The outcomes only depend, of course, on average effects of an allele if the population is large and panmictic.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, they're both rights. Wait, I'm trying to make a pun there. What the right argument, though, is that populations often are not big and panmictic, that they're often highly substructured with inbreeding. With high population structure, you can get a lot of different outcomes.
Yeah.
So is that where we should be looking in small peripheral populations or whatever, for evidence of the emergence of cooperation and selfishness both?
Yeah, I guess it depends if the kind of cooperation you're interested in is in kind of like the formation of new kind of it's like co-adaptive complex gene complex within a kind of current eukaryote versus like if you're interested in the origin of the first genomes as they, which which may or may not have much in common with each other, like the origin of the first genome what maintains cooperation and conflict in current genomes. It may have been, I don't know what I've seen about it, but it may well be that, like, I once wrote this paper about arguing that, trying to argue that studying genetic conflicts is a great way to understand transitions in individuality. This idea, like, you go from the origin of the first genome or the origin of multicellular bodies, where you have entities that previously survived and producing on their own, can now only do so as part of a larger whole. And that's it, like, we should study, like, contemporary genetic conflict as a way to understand how and why conflicts arise and are resolved. And one of the reviewers pointed out, like, why would we think that, like, current conflicts has anything to do with, like, the kind of conflict that exists at the beginning? At that point, I don't have a good answer to that, other than, like, we kind of clean, what else are we going to do?
Well, wouldn't Dawkins talk about the extended phenotype and the fact that genes within an organism change their environments in ways that may benefit them?
Yeah, no, this is true, and I think, like, that's I would say it's that's one of the kind of more the most novel things that came out of his of this story. It's kind of like, what upsets some people is that he wants to, like, remove the organism from the story, and that, like, may seem preposterous, because, like, isn't that what we're trying to study? But for certain kinds of things, it's a really helpful way, because, like, it just, again, depending on how you view the world, things stand out, right? Like, now you start seeing that, like, the effect of a gene is not restricted to the body in which it happens to reside. It's going to have effects all around it, and it becomes, the world looks differently when you look at it.
Do you find it ironic that the proponent of the selfish gene, this ultra reductive molecular level, ends up being a holist in the sense that he's talking about these things?
So I don't think it would count as a holist, but there's some great ironies in this debate. Like, maybe I'll land this on one of my favorite ones. So when you ask two people that have been associated with the genes I view, of course, George Williams, but also Edward Blake, the opponent of genes. The two examples that they would consider as, like, maybe good examples of group selection in natural populations were both about the T allele in mice, which is kind of meiotic driver. So there were the only times that you could think that maybe this is actually group selection. This is, of course, ironic, because it's something like elements are sometimes been viewed as the ultimate empirical indication of a gene set view. But I think it also goes to show that you can often reconcile many different kind of perspectives with the world around.
I was struck by two, like, historical aspects you talked about. The first was Fisher's importance in the gene's eye view, and then the second was Newton's, I guess, issues with the gene's eye view. And it's interesting just because Fisher was such a big eugenicist, and then Newton is kind of responding against a lot of, like, scientific racism, eugenics. Do you see a legacy of eugenics and eugenical thinking in the gene's eye view?
Yeah, so I think that they kind of, like, there has been that association, right? Particularly because, like, the genes have often been accused of the simplistic view of genetics, and basically kind of debates about genetic determinism in it. To the extent that the genes have been more so than other parts of evolutionary biology, or to be painted with that brush, I'm not sure. It certainly was, like, a big thing that, like, both, like, Lewinson and, like, Britain's Newton, Stephen Rose, was very critical and wanted to make that connection. I think still I have to think more about how to have a proper view on the kind of social side of it. Like, I've been very, like, narrowly focused on, like, what are the kind of things we can say from this. I am more interested in it. So I've been, when I was still affiliated to an extent to the department in Uppsala, and there I've been working with a graduate student in theology who's very interested in the kind of use of the word selfish in evolutionary biology. So in the selfish gene, selfish is used in this kind of at least 3 different ways, and it kind of glides between them somewhat uncritically. That, like, it's the kind of selfish in the sense that all genes are considered selfish because they try to maximize their. It's selfish in a more kind of technical sense, that, like, a selfish act between 2 individuals in populations, that an actor is selfish if it benefits them at the cost of another actor in the population. That's a selfish act. And the third, of course, is, like, what we kind of day-to-day would mean by selfish, so, like, kind of something about intentions and morals. And the selfish gene somewhat kind of glides between that. And I've always thought, oh, well, that's somewhat kind of like that's not really the point. The point is that genes have this, like, unique thing that they're transmitted, and, like, they are the beneficial thing. And I've been arguing that you can kind of pull that out. But can you? So he's very true to say that you can't like separate it out. Can you separate these ideas out from the originators? I think I had that kind of like typical science answer that yes, you can, but I think it's also something that we should critically reflect upon. That.
We have time for one quick question.
Do you think heterosis is a good model for gene cooperation, that alleles are essentially cooperating with each other?
So, what kind? Sorry.
Heterosis.
Yeah, maybe. I think my own struggles to come up with it reflects that I haven't thought much about it. To the extent I thought about it, it's like in this like the earliest days of what a genome would be like. You go from some sort of like self-replicating molecules to some sort of a primitive genome. But in some ways, I think it is like I think like a genic view of what the species is some sort of like a larger kind of co-adaptive gene complex that like that's what it is. But like how to go from that kind of like verbal model to something like that we could actually study empirically or do like proper models of, I'm not sure, but I think it's a topic that has been somewhat under studied. So maybe once I've convinced people that they should study more genetic conflicts, we'll move on to genetic cooperation.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for everyone that has time. Please join us on the YouTube space over here to continue discussing. Thank you.
Yeah, see, I think, yeah. Yeah, I think you're probably get a insight.